Welcome ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about tanks in general and not just one tank in specific. I thought this video was necessary because a lot of people seem to be getting the wrong idea about tanks. They think that tanks are these invincible monsters which can do anything they want, and if they get destroyed they are just obsolete and outdated. So today we're going to take a look at the history of tanks and talk about what the terms mean and if they are obsolete or not. The tank was first made by the British, which called this tank the Mark I, and it was to serve to break the trench warfare and take the fight to the enemies. But in the beginning they were quite unreliable, slow, and the tactics were quite unrefined. During the interwar period there weren't any major wars where they could test out their new innovations. So the Allies kept on developing their tanks for trench warfare. This would mean slow tanks which were long and heavily armored. So take for example the Matilda II from the British and the Char B1 Bis from the French. Both which were very capable in their own right for sure. However, the Germans decided to take another approach. They would prefer speed and decent firepower, a choice which would eventually play a part in the French capitulation. Even though the French definitely had an upper hand in a 1v1 tank battle, they still lost. Once Operation Barbarossa started, Germany started to encounter another philosophy in tank design. I'm of course talking about two very famous tanks. One of which is the T-34 medium tank, which had good speed, relatively easy to repair and efficient armor. And the other one was of course the KV-1 heavy tank, with a lot of armor at the time. It was basically frontally impenetrable to any German tank fielded at the time. So Germany made some changes to its main medium tank, giving it more armor and a better main armament so it could take on the T-34 and the KV-1 tanks. However, over the course of the war, Germany started to invest more in more armor and stronger main armaments, neglecting their reliability. They also overcomplicated their tanks to some degree, making it more difficult to repair. In addition, Germany was also fielding a lot of different vehicles from a lot of different manufacturers, which made everything all the more complicated. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was only really investing in the T-34 and upgraded versions and assault tanks, which include but are not limited to the IS-2 and the ISU-152 line. The Americans mainly focused on the Sherman tank and improving it, and the British started the war with a very formidable tank, the Matilda II, but over the course of the war this was of course outclassed. After they introduced several tanks which some considered to be outdated from the moment they entered service. These tanks are of course the Covenanter, the Crusader and the Cromwell. The Comet was actually a very good step in the right direction but came way too late. But in the late stage of World War II they introduced one of the best tanks ever to have fought in a conflict. This tank is of course the Centurion, which dominated the battlefield for the next 30 years after World War II. Japan on the other hand only saw tanks in a armored reconnaissance kind of role and didn't invest too much in tanks. In terms of tank quality during World War II they have one of the weakest, if not the weakest major country. After the Second World War there were only a couple of tanks which were very good. These tanks were of course the Centurion and later the Challenger series from the UK, the Patton and later the Abrams series from the USA, the T continuation line from the Soviet Union and also the IS continuation line, but that one eventually ended. Then you also have the Leclerc tanks from France, the Merkava from Israel, the Type 90 from Japan, the Leopards from Germany and the Black Panther from South Korea. After World War II the entire idea of heavy tanks, medium tanks, tank destroyers were all forgotten and these were replaced by the term main battle tank. This was essentially the best features of the medium tank and the best features of the heavy tank combined into one vehicle. So these features include extremely capable main armament, good efficient armor, but the speed and maneuverability of medium tanks. After World War II they also got rid of the more traditional ammunition for tanks, so the shells got replaced by rockets or dart-like projectiles. Also systems like autoloaders became very popular, notably under Russian tanks. It of course had its advantages and disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that in the case of the Russian tanks most of their ammunition is stored in the turret. Once a round has penetrated the entire tank blows to smithereens. Another downside is that in general a human loader is quicker than an autoloader and that the autoloading system is another system to maintain which can also break. An advantage is that you have one loader less, which means that you can have a lower profile. The lower profile of course means that you're harder to hit and this is a serious advantage. Also if you're hit it generally creates less casualties because you have less crew members. Tanks in general have something which is called the all or nothing side. This is generally the front of the vehicle which is very heavily armored compared to the sides which are more lightly armored. The prime example of this is of course the Panther and the Sherman medium tanks from World War II. Both have a very well armored front but less well armored sides. There are of course exceptions to this rule, like for example the Soviet IS-2 tank, which is very well armored also on the sides. Some tanks only have a very well armored cupola like the Centurion, while the hull is less well armored. This makes the tank a prime candidate for a hull down position. As the name suggests, it is a position where you basically hide your hull. You only expose your main armament or gun to the enemy. This reduces the silhouette of the tank and hides the more vulnerable spots. For example, use rubble, or you can just dig a hull down position by using yourself some special equipment. The elevation and depression of the main armament and armored fighting vehicles is also very important, especially when you fight on longer distances, which is very common especially on the Eastern Front. The depression is useful when you're in a more elevated position. The elevation is useful when you're fighting on longer distances and you need to take the gravity into account when firing. As you can notice, some tanks have a more angled front than other tanks. Angling armor plates has been around since the middle of the 1930s or even earlier. The advantage of angling your armor is that you basically multiply your armor thickness. So if you would have 90mm of steel and you would angle it at a 30-degree angle, the shell of the enemies has to travel through 180mm, making you use less steel for the same effect as 180mm of steel. This is very resource effective and it also saves you weight, but it's generally way harder to build than flat armor. It also takes a lot more space, so as you can imagine it is not so crew friendly. Tanks generally had a crew of 4. These generally were the commander, the gunner, the loader and the driver. Of course exceptions were there, with sometimes 2 loaders, a co-driver, an idiot radio operator or a hull machine gunner. And the names pretty much already say what the jobs were. Generally the World War II tanks had a 3-man charge system, and these were for the commander, the loader and the gunner, and then you would have the driver in front. But this also mostly depends on which tank or armored fighting vehicle you're talking about. It is sometimes difficult to know the difference between tanks and tank destroyers, but these are 2 easy ways to identify a tank. First off, it depends on how the country from which the tank originates from identifies it. Even if it's lacking a certain characteristics which normally are used to describe a tank destroyer or something else, if the country in question says it's a tank, it's a tank. For example, one of the only British heavy assault tanks, better known as the Tortoise, is referred to as a heavy assault tank. So even though it's lacking a cupola, which is one of the characteristics commonly used to describe tanks, it is still a tank. All the while vehicles like the Panther, which has a lot in common with the Tortoise, for example lacking a turret, is a tank destroyer. But there are a lot of exceptions to this rule, for example the Hellcat and the Wolverine tank destroyers, which both have a turret. The gun, also known as the main armament, is an important part of the tank and it needs a good name to make sure that people recognize it. And every country decided to give their main armaments a different name. In my humble opinion, the Germans did it the best way, because when you take the main armament of the Panther, the 88mm KWK 43L71, it is easy to know what kind of gun it is. The 88mm stands for the diameter of the round, the KWK 43 means the Kampfwagenkanone or the chariot gun translated, and the L71 means that the diameter of the round, so 88mm in this case, can fit 71 times in the barrel, and that will mean that the barrel is 6.2 meters roughly. The British during World War II used to name their main armaments pounders, so you would have the 2, 6 and 17 pounder, and the Americans and the Soviets just used the diameter of the rounds in millimeters and then added what type it was. Tanks are expensive to make and especially to buy when you buy them from another nation. One of these modern vehicles might set you back 13 to 15 million US dollars. But what you have to keep in mind is that these modern Western tanks are filled with the latest technologies. It is essentially a piece of metal which has to carry 70 tons of weight over all terrains with stabilizers, lasers, ammunition to be able to destroy any well-fortified position, and all the while keeping every minuscule detail hidden for other countries. One of the misconceptions about tanks is that they're supposed to be invincible, that they're supposed to be able to wreck an entire enemy army, and honestly this is not true. Just like any other military unit, they are dependent on other types of units. This is called combined arms, where the infantry units and armored units help each other to deal with each other's weaknesses. A weakness for the tanks would be that an infantryman can quite easily sneak up to a tank and destroy them with an anti-tank weapon. You can also see this in modern war, so for example Russia, who is sometimes not using their tanks properly in a strategic manner, and losing all their manpower due to silly mistakes they should have learned 100 years ago. But even though a lot of people just always want to bash on Russia for this, Russia is not the only country which has made this mistake recently. Turkey has made this mistake as well in Syria when they were in Syria with their Leopards, sending them in without any infantry support, which is just doomed to fail. Over the last 100 years, the combat ways of the tank had changed a lot. From going from trying to break the trench stalemate to dominating breakthrough force to eventually a more supportive type of fighting. And so for the last 70 years people have been speaking about that tanks are unjustifiably expensive and obsolete. And the only thing I can say about that is the only thing that will happen in the next 50 years is at best that the role of tanks will change once again, but they won't be phased out anytime soon. Because when used properly, they are still extremely effective. So anyways, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I was busy with a massive video, but that one was taking too long, so I decided to make a explanation video about tanks. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe. There's a major video on the way, so keep an eye out for that. And I'll see you guys in the next video. I have a video on the left, a playlist on the right. Other than that, have a very good day.